I want to tell you something before I get into this. I'm not the kind of person who exaggerates. I've never been that person. My mother used to say I had the flattest delivery in the family, which was her polite way of saying I was boring at dinner. I don't embellish. I don't add things for drama. When I tell you what happened in the Merlith system on the 43rd day of the Terran expansion year 2387, I need you to understand that every single word of it is exactly what I saw, heard, and felt. Because if I exaggerate even a little, I lose the most important part of the story. The most important part is the silence. Not the silence before the fleet arrived, not the silence after the cannons cooled. I mean the silence that happened in the middle, the silence that came from the human side of things, when the Vrethkai Galactic Empire sent their war declaration and activated their forward artillery arrays and pointed approximately 60,000 warships at our little outpost on the edge of colonized space. That silence, the one that lasted about 4 seconds before someone on our side said, "Yeah, okay," and went back to eating their lunch. That's what this story is about. I was 24 years old when I was stationed at Frontier Station Merlith. I joined up 2 years prior, right out of the agricultural districts of what used to be called southern Brazil. My family grew soybeans. My grandmother grew soybeans. My great-grandmother, before the climate restructuring, grew coffee and then gave up on coffee and grew soybeans. So you could say I come from a long line of people who learned to deal with what the land gave them and make something out of it. That's the kind of person Earth kept sending to the frontier, I think. Not warriors, not conquerors, just people who'd looked at hard ground before and figured out what to plant in it. Merlith itself was a beautiful place to be stationed, if you could ignore the fact that the Vrethkai claimed it as their ancestral territory and had been sending increasingly aggressive diplomatic messages for about 6 months before everything changed. The station sat on the edge of a gas cloud, Merlith Cloud, obviously. We were never very creative with names, and the way the light from the twin suns refracted through, it painted the sky in these long, slow ribbons of color. Violet and copper and this deep, bruised green that I still don't have a proper word for. Every evening it looked like the galaxy itself was bleeding, but in the most peaceful way imaginable. We had about 4,000 personnel on the station. Military, science, infrastructure, some civilian contractors who were building out the deep range relay network. It was cramped in the way that frontier stations always are: narrow corridors, shared bunks, the kind of recycled air that you stop noticing after the first week but never quite stop tasting. We had 2 real restaurants, one recreational facility that doubled as a worship space on religious observance days, and one bar called the Margin, which was where most of human culture at Merlith actually happened. I was assigned to external monitoring, which sounds impressive until you realize it mostly meant sitting in front of a sensor array for 8 hours watching the gas cloud do nothing, and then writing a report saying the gas cloud did nothing. My direct supervisor was a woman named Lieutenant Commander Preet Akafer, and she had the most organized mind I've ever encountered in another human being. She kept a physical notebook, actual paper, which she'd brought from Earth in her personal luggage allowance, and every morning she wrote down the 3 things she expected to happen that day. Not hoped, not feared, expected. I asked her once if she was ever wrong. She said, constantly, but it helps to have written down what you thought was coming. On the 43rd day, she came in with her notebook and wrote 3 things. Sensor relay calibration, 800. Resupply shuttle, 1400. Gas cloud variance report, 1700. She did not write, Galactic Empire declares war. Neither of us saw that coming. It started small. Everything does, I think. 6:12 station time. I was running early checks, the kind you do on autopilot while you're still half asleep. Mug of whatever they were calling coffee that week balanced on the console beside me. The sensor array was quiet. The gas cloud was doing its thing. The twin suns were at their first conjunction, which made the light through the viewport absolutely extraordinary, this warm, doubled gold that made everything look slightly magical and also slightly on fire. I wasn't thinking about the Vrethkai. Nobody was, really. Not at 612. The diplomatic situation was tense, yes. Command had briefed us in that careful, don't panic but be aware way that military briefings have. The Vrethkai had sent a 7th formal protest to the Terran Expansion Authority about our presence in the Murlith system. The authority had sent back a 7th formal response, noting that the station was within unclaimed neutral space under the Kareth Accord of 2341. The Vrethkai had sent an 8th protest, saying the Kareth Accord was a human document that the Galactic Empire didn't recognize because they hadn't been at the negotiating table. The authority had sent back an 8th response, noting that representatives of the Galactic Empire had in fact been at the negotiating table and had agreed to the terms, and could they please locate their own records. This had apparently gone poorly. But that was happening at the diplomatic level. Up here, on the frontier, it was 612 and I was tired and my coffee tasted like reconstituted ambition, and the gas cloud was beautiful and nothing was wrong. Then the sensor array made a sound I hadn't heard before. Not an alarm, not a klaxon, just a soft, ascending tone like a question being asked that I'd only seen in the manual under the heading, Mass Displacement Event Class 7 or above. I set down my coffee. The display updated. I read the numbers. I read them again. Then I did the thing you're never supposed to do in external monitoring, which is assume your instruments are wrong because they usually aren't, and even when they are, assuming so is how people die. I pressed the alert. Preet arrived within 4 minutes. She had her notebook. She sat down beside me, looked at the display, and was quiet for exactly 6 seconds. I know because I counted. Then she said, "That's a lot of ships." "Yes, ma'am." "How many?" "Current count is," I checked the running tally, 62,411. They're still dropping out of fold space. Preet was quiet again. She wrote something in her notebook. "Contact Commander Rills," she said. "Wake him up if you have to." I contacted Commander Rills. I had to wake him up. He arrived looking like a man who'd been yanked from sleep, which he had, because nobody senior was on shift at 612. That's the whole point of 612. He looked at the display. He had a very specific expression, the kind of expression you'd have if you were absolutely certain you were misreading something but slowly becoming less certain. 62,000, he said. 63 now, sir. He exhaled very slowly through his nose. "Get me a channel to Authority Command," he said, "and someone wake up the rest of the senior staff. And," he paused, glancing toward the corridor, "don't go station-wide yet. No need to panic people. Not yet." He was very calm about it. That was the first thing I noticed. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't pacing. He sat down in the duty chair, folded his hands, and waited for the channel to Authority Command to open, the same way you'd wait for a bus. I thought, is this normal? Is this how people react? I didn't know then, I do now. By 7:30, word had gotten around anyway. You can't keep 63,000 warships off the general gossip network in a 4,000-person station for very long, especially when the people working external monitoring aren't exactly renowned for their discretion. I'll take partial responsibility for that. The main corridor outside our section had a few small clusters of people, off-duty personnel, some contractors, a couple of the science team who'd been up late with the cloud variance data. They were looking at their personal displays, talking in low voices. Some of them had gone to the viewports as if they'd be able to see anything with the naked eye. You couldn't, not at this range, but people look anyway. It's instinct. What I noticed was the tone of it. Nobody was screaming. Nobody was running. There was anxiety, yes. You could feel it in the air. this particular flavor of tension that I can only describe as the feeling of realizing something is actually happening and not just a drill. But there was also something else underneath it, something I didn't have a name for yet. Later I'd call it confidence, but that's not quite right either. It was more like familiarity, like people recognizing a problem they'd seen some version of before. A woman from the geological survey team named Bex. I knew her slightly. We'd had dinner in the cafeteria a few times, was leaning against the corridor wall, arms crossed, looking at her display with an expression of mild concentration. 63,000, she said to nobody in particular. That's actually more than they sent against the Pethiari Belt colonies. Her colleague, I didn't know his name, said, Pethiari Belt had better orbital defenses though. We've got better response time. Oh. That was the whole conversation, like they were discussing a sports score. I kept walking. In the next section, two infrastructure contractors were arguing about whether the folding pattern of the Vrethkai fleet indicated a standard encirclement formation, or something more specific to deep space siege doctrine. One of them had a diagram on his display that he'd apparently drawn himself. They were disagreeing politely, but firmly, the way people do when they're both pretty confident they're right and have the time to prove it. I realized, somewhere between that conversation and the next, that not a single person I'd seen in the last 10 minutes had the look of someone who believed they were going to die. The war declaration came through officially at 8:47. It was broadcast on the standard interspecies diplomatic frequency, translated into 17 languages simultaneously, and received at our communications array with all the ceremony of a particularly aggressive performance review. Commander Rills listened to it in the main briefing room with his senior staff and several senior scientists and me, because I'd been the one to spot the fleet and Preet had said I should be in the room. The translation was formal. The Vrethkai used a particular register for official communications that made everything sound like it was being read from a very old and very serious book. The substance of it was this: the Vrethkai Galactic Empire, by authority of the Eternal Throne and the 18 Great Houses, formally and irrevocably declared a state of war against Terran Expansion Station Merlith, and by extension, against the human species and all territories under Terran jurisdiction. They would allow 48 standard hours for voluntary evacuation of noncombatants before initiating active bombardment. Any military resistance would result in immediate escalation. They expected total surrender within 72 hours of first contact. It was, honestly, a very polite war declaration. I've read others since, and some of them are less organized. There was a pause after it finished. Then Commander Rills said, "Right." He looked around the room. He seemed to be thinking, not panicking, not strategizing urgently, just thinking in that deliberate way of someone who knows the shape of a problem and is deciding where to start. "Dr. Castellan," he said to the head of the science team, "how's the cloud variance data looking?" Dr. Castellan blinked. I'm sorry. The Merlith cloud. You were finishing the variance report." Yes, but sir, we've just received a war declaration from a 63,000 ship fleet." 64, someone corrected. "I know," Commander Rills said, "and we'll address that. I just want to know where we stand on the cloud data, because it affects our options, and I'd rather have good information going into this." Dr. Castellan stared at him for a moment, then opened his display and started pulling up the cloud data. That's when I understood. It wasn't that they weren't taking it seriously. They were taking it extremely seriously. Commander Rills was already calculating. He was already moving the pieces. He was asking about the cloud data because the cloud data was relevant, because whatever he was thinking about doing with this situation involved understanding the Merlith cloud's properties in detail. They weren't panicking because panic wasn't useful. And they weren't scared because, I think, looking back, they'd made a decision somewhere, maybe as a species, maybe just as people who'd volunteered for the frontier. That fear was something you acknowledged and then set aside and got on with it. I'm going to tell you what the Vrethkai expected to happen. I know this because, much later, after the whole thing was done and the records were accessible, I read the communications from the Eternal Throne that had been captured and translated. The Vrethkai had a very specific expectation of how this would go. They expected panic first, then frantic communication back to Earth, pleas for evacuation, requests for negotiation, possibly an emergency diplomatic mission. They expected the human station to begin voluntary withdrawal within 6 to 12 hours. They expected that their show of force alone, 64,000 warships, every one of them larger than anything humans had publicly deployed, would constitute sufficient coercion to make active combat unnecessary. In their strategic modeling documents, the section titled Probability of Armed Human Resistance was one paragraph long. It assessed the probability at 4.7%. They were wrong. Not because humans were reckless, not because we didn't understand the situation. We understood the situation extremely well, which is actually exactly the reason things went the way they did. The margin bar was open at 900. This was unusual. The bar normally didn't open until 1400, but the manager, a civilian contractor named Yusuf Dag, had apparently decided that the day warranted flexibility. He'd opened up, put on something with a slow beat that you felt more than heard, and was methodically setting out glasses on the counter. When I walked past at 9:10, there were already about 40 people in there. They weren't drinking heavily. Mostly they were nursing whatever they'd ordered and talking, low, serious, concentrated conversations happening at almost every table. I recognized people from different departments, engineers talking to scientists, soldiers talking to contractors. The kind of cross-departmental mixing that usually only happened at official functions or genuine emergencies. This was, I supposed, both. A man named Corporal Vassal from 2nd Ground Defense was at the bar by himself, working through a small plate of eggs, actual eggs, synthesized, but they'd gotten the texture right, and looking at something on his display with an expression of thoughtful concentration. He had the kind of face that looked naturally calm, the sort that in a photograph would make you think he was half asleep, but in person you realized was just economical with its expressions. "Corporal," I said. "Raise," he glanced up. "You look like someone who just received a war declaration." 64,000 ships. I heard 65 now. It keeps going up. "Yeah," he said. He looked back at his display. "They're doing a psychological thing. Keeps rolling out more ships, trickling the number upward, supposed to wear down your sense of proportion. Like if you hear 60,000 and then 70,000 and then 80,000, eventually your brain gives up trying to assign meaning to the number and you just feel helpless." He ate a bite of egg. "Does it work?" I asked. "Probably does on most species." He shrugged. "Us, I think we just start calculating." "Calculating what?" He turned the display toward me. He'd been mapping the fleet disposition, the positions of the Vrethkai ships relative to the station, relative to the cloud, relative to the fold points they'd emerged from. He'd color-coded by ship class, and he'd drawn trajectory projections in dotted lines, and in the corner of the display he'd written a series of numbers that I didn't fully understand but that clearly meant something to him. "Angles," he said simply. "If they're going to bombard, they have to come from here or here." He pointed. "That gas cloud interferes with their targeting arrays. The electromagnetic variance messes with precision fire at certain frequencies, so they want to minimize cloud interference. Which means they're going to cluster toward the ecliptic, which means their formation has gaps here and here." He tapped 2 points on the display. "You figured this out by yourself?" "Me and about half the engineering team, apparently. Raise, we've got 4,000 people on this station. Some of them are very smart. When you give very smart people an interesting problem and don't tell them to panic, they analyze it. Who told them not to panic? He smiled for the first time. Nobody, they just didn't. The 48-hour evacuation window was the strangest 2 days of my life. Commander Rills called a full station briefing at 1100. He stood at the front of the largest gathering space we had, the multi-use hall, which normally housed the twice-monthly social functions and on religious days smelled like incense. And he spoke clearly and without notes for about 12 minutes. He acknowledged the situation. He acknowledged the scale of the Vrethkai fleet. He acknowledged that this was a genuine military threat and that nobody should minimize it. He described our communication with authority command and the fact that a response was being coordinated. He laid out the 48-hour window and what it meant practically. Then he said something that I've thought about many times since. He said, "I'm not going to tell you what to feel about this. You're adults and you'll feel what you feel. What I will tell you is what I know. And what I know is that the Vrethkai fleet is positioned as a show of force, and shows of force by their nature are designed to produce one thing, a decision on our part. They want us to make a decision, and they've already decided what they want that decision to be." He paused. "What we do in the next 48 hours is make a different decision. No stirring speech, no promise of glory, no theatrical call to arms, just that. We make a different decision." The hall was quiet for a moment. Then people started talking to each other, the way they do when they've heard something worth chewing on, and the briefing broke up, and people went back to their sections. I walked back to external monitoring. Preet was at her console. She'd opened the cloud variance data alongside the fleet disposition data and was running what appeared to be a correlation analysis. "Ma'am," I said. "Sit down, Rays. Run me the updated positions on the outer fleet elements." I sat down. I ran the positions. We worked for 6 hours without stopping. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough in the histories. The Vrethkai had excellent intelligence on our station. They knew our personnel count. They knew our weapons loadout, modest, frontier grade, nothing extraordinary. They knew our shield capacity and its limitations. They knew our communication infrastructure and the lag time to Earth. What they didn't know, what they fundamentally couldn't have known, because it wasn't the kind of thing that shows up in intelligence reports, was what we were like. Not the military hardware, not the defensive specifications, the actual people, the texture of us. They didn't know that Yusuf would open the bar at 900, so people had somewhere to think. They didn't know that Vassal would spend the morning mapping fleet gaps with a plate of eggs. They didn't know that Dr. Castellan would go back to his cloud variance data, not because he was ignoring the crisis, but because the data was relevant to the crisis, and he was the kind of person who addresses problems by first learning everything there is to know about them. They didn't know that Preet would open her notebook and write, very neatly, below her 3 expected items for the day. 64,000 ships, also learn the cloud. They didn't know that 4,000 people on a frontier station, when confronted with the most powerful fleet force in the outer systems, would collectively, quietly, without being told to, begin to work. Part 2, the cloud knows things. By the end of the first day, the station had transformed. Not physically. The corridors looked the same. The lights were the same slightly too harsh white that made everyone look like they hadn't slept enough. The air still tasted like recycled ambitions. But the way people were moving through the station had changed. There was a purposefulness to it, a directedness that hadn't been there before. People weren't wandering. They were going places specifically for reasons. The engineering team had essentially turned the lower maintenance deck into a secondary operations center, which Commander Rills had quietly authorized, because, frankly, it was already happening, and he was smart enough to not get in the way of people doing useful things. 3 of the scientists had requisitioned additional sensor time to refine their understanding of the cloud's electromagnetic properties. The communications team was running on rotating shifts to maintain continuous contact with Authority Command, which was, as Preet had rather dryly noted, having a moment back on Earth. I slept 4 hours that first night, not because anyone told me not to sleep more, but because I kept waking up with ideas that felt urgent, and I'd given up fighting it around 300 and just gone back to my console. The thing I'd been working on was the cloud. Vassal had pointed to it as a defensive element, the way the electromagnetic variants interfered with Vrethkai targeting systems. But the more I looked at the data, the more I thought he was only seeing part of it. The cloud wasn't just interference, it was structure. It had patterns, complicated, fractal patterns, in the way the ionized particles distributed themselves, that you could, if you were paying close enough attention, read like a map. The cloud wasn't random. Things moved through it. Not ships, not anything artificial, but energy, the long-wave electromagnetic pulses that the twin suns sent through the system. Those pulses hit the cloud and scattered, but they scattered in predictable ways. If you understood the scattering pattern well enough, you could calculate the state of the cloud at any point in three-dimensional space, which meant you could use it as a sensor array, Dr. Castellan said, at 3:30 station time, looking at my screen over my shoulder. He'd apparently had the same thought and followed it to the same place. He'd brought coffee, real coffee, which I'd later learn he'd been hoarding in his quarters for emergencies, and had decided this qualified. Sort of, I said. Not precisely. The resolution would be rough, but if you were trying to track large objects. Large objects like warships. Large objects like warships. Yes. Then the cloud's own response to their presence would tell you where they were, even if they were trying to be dark. Dr. Castellan sat down in the empty chair next to my console. He drank his coffee. He thought about it. The Vrethkai wouldn't know we could do this, he said. They wouldn't know it was possible. Nobody's done it before. The cloud's too thick for standard sensors to parse. It's been classified as a dead zone since we arrived. But it's not a dead zone. It's the opposite of a dead zone. I tried to find the word. It's a mirror if you know how to read it. Castellan set down his coffee. He pulled out his own display. We need to talk to Rills, he said. At 3:30. He gave me a look. Do you think he's sleeping? He wasn't. Commander Rills listened to us for 20 minutes without interrupting. He had dark circles under his eyes that suggested he'd been awake for most of the previous 20 hours, but his mind was sharp. You could tell by the quality of his questions, which came at precise moments and cut directly to the points that mattered. When we'd finished, he sat quietly for a moment. How accurate? He asked. Rough, I said honestly. We'd need to develop the calibration from scratch, and that takes time, within the 48-hour window. How accurate by hour 40? Rills asked. I looked at Castellan. Castellan looked at me. Enough to track fleet movement in the cloud periphery, Castellan said carefully. Not precise targeting, but positions, formations. If they move, we'd see it before standard sensors would. How long before? At their likely approach velocity. Castellan did the calculation in his head, which I found impressive at 3:30 in the morning, perhaps 12 minutes. Rills nodded once. Do it, he said, full resources. Whatever you need. Sir, I started. I should mention that this is somewhat outside my designated assignment. Rills looked at me with an expression that was patient and also very slightly amused. Corporal Rays, he said, I don't particularly care about designated assignments this week. We have something like 47 hours left in a diplomatic window before a 65,000 ship fleet starts considering active bombardment. If you have an idea that might be useful, please have it. Yes, sir. And get some sleep at some point. Yes, sir. I didn't sleep. The 48-hour clock was ticking somewhere in the back of everyone's consciousness. You could feel it, not as panic, but as a kind of sharpening. The closer it got to zero, the more concentrated the work became. Conversations got shorter. People moved faster. The cafeteria was on extended hours serving continuous meals, and nobody was timing their breaks. Authority Command had dispatched a response fleet. That was confirmed at hour 26. But the response fleet was 12 hours out at minimum. They'd been in transit for most of the second day. So there was a gap. A window between when the Vrethkai deadline expired and when human reinforcements arrived, during which we were either going to have to hold, withdraw, or negotiate. Command's instruction was clear. Do not initiate hostilities, but do not surrender the station. What that meant practically was something Commander Rills was spending a great deal of time working out. I was in external monitoring when Vassal came in at hour 31. He had another plate of food, not eggs this time, something indefinite in a sauce, and he sat down at an empty console and started pulling up data without asking permission, which in any other circumstance would have been irregular, but we'd largely stopped worrying about irregular. "Cloud's doing something interesting," he said. "I know," I said. "The fleet moved about 2 hours ago, shifted toward the ecliptic like you predicted." "Like I predicted." "You were right about the gaps." He ate a bite of his indefinite sauce thing. "They're forming up, that's a siege position." "Yes." "They're not going to bombard when the clock hits zero." I looked at him. "Why not?" "Because sieges and bombardment are different doctrines. Bombardment is what you do when you want to destroy. Siege is what you do when you want to capture." He turned his display toward me. He'd updated his map. The color-coded positions of the Vrethkai fleet had shifted, and I could see now what he meant. They weren't in an assault formation. They were in a surrounding formation, an encirclement. They don't want to destroy the station. Too valuable, the relay network, the cloud research, the infrastructure. They want to take it intact. Which means when the clock hits zero, they're going to cut off our communications and wait for us to decide it's not worth it. I thought about that. "But we have the cloud sensor system," I said. "We can still see through the cloud, even if they jam the standard comms." "Does Authority Command know about the cloud system?" I paused. "They know we're developing it. We sent the summary up channel at hour 20. "They know it in theory," Vassal said. "The question is whether they can calibrate their end of it quickly enough to use it for live communication." I was already opening a new channel. The technical details of what happened over the next 8 hours are complicated, and I'll spare you the granular specifics, but the short version is this. The cloud sensor system, which had begun as a way to track fleet positions, turned out to be adaptable, with significant creative interpretation, into a low-bandwidth communication relay. The ionized particles of the Merlith cloud could carry modulated signals if you understood their scattering patterns precisely enough to encode information in the interference. It was like writing letters with weather. It was also, technically speaking, completely unprecedented. Nobody had done it. The physics allowed it, but nobody had sat down to work out the method because nobody had needed to before. We needed to before. The team that figured it out was me, Dr. Castellan, a graduate student named Pira who was on the station for her dissertation research, and turned out to have an almost supernatural intuition for electromagnetic systems, and an engineer named Marcus who'd been scheduled to do structural maintenance that week, but had wandered into the discussion and refused to leave. We worked in the sensor room for approximately 36 consecutive hours, sleeping in shifts, eating whatever the cafeteria would send down, and arguing about signal modulation in tones that got increasingly fragmented as fatigue set in. At hour 42, 6 hours before the Vrethkai deadline, we sent our first successfully encoded message through the cloud. It was 3 words. We are ready. Preet, reading the confirmation from authority command on the other end, nodded in the quiet way she had, wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked at me and said, "Now we wait." Part 3, the moment they didn't expect. Hour 47. I've thought about this a lot, about how to describe the station in the last hour before the deadline. I keep coming back to the same word, and the word is focused. Not calm, exactly. There was still the underlying vibration of knowing exactly how large the fleet outside was, and exactly what it could theoretically do to our hull. But focused. Everyone had a job. Everyone was doing it. The panic that the Vrethkai had expected to see consuming us within the first few hours had simply not materialized. Or rather, it had materialized and then been redirected, like energy being channeled rather than dissipated. The station felt like a machine that had just found its purpose. Commander Rills had been awake for, by my count, somewhere between 38 and 40 hours. He didn't look it in the way you'd expect. There were signs, yes, the tiredness around his eyes, the economy of his movements, but his voice was steady and his thinking was clear. He was at the main command console in the operations center, and around him were the people who'd spent the last 2 days building everything we had. Vassal with his fleet maps, Castellan with his cloud data, Pira with the communication relay, Marcus with the engineering calculations. And me, for some reason, still there, still watching. At hour 47, the Vrethkai sent a secondary communication. It was from someone who identified themselves as First Commander Velthari, and the translated version had a different register than the original war declaration, less formal, more direct, more personal. The First Commander said, essentially, that the deadline had nearly expired, that they were aware the station had not begun evacuation procedures, that they found this noteworthy, and were extending the observation that the human tendency toward procedural adherence in the face of strategic inevitability was well documented in their intelligence files, but that the present situation exceeded the threshold at which such adherence remained tactically viable. He was, very politely, telling us we were being stubborn to our own detriment. Rills dictated a response. He kept it brief. He said, "Thank you for your communication, First Commander. Please be advised that the Terran station Murilith is a functioning scientific and military installation operating within legitimate claim under the Kareth Accord, and we remain committed to that position. We note that your fleet has assumed a siege disposition rather than an assault disposition, and we interpret this as an indication that you share our preference for a resolution that preserves the station's infrastructure. We look forward to continuing this conversation." He sent it. For a moment, the operations center was very quiet. Then Marcus said, "You just told them we know they're not going to bombard." "Yes," said Rills. "Is that strategic?" "It removes the threat," Rills said simply. "If they believe we believe they'll bombard, that threat has power over us. If they know we know they won't, it doesn't. We've been pretending not to have figured that out. It's been useful for the last 2 days. Now the clock is almost up, and I'd rather have an honest conversation." Preet looked up from her console. "You think they'll negotiate?" "I think they came here wanting to win," Rills said, "not wanting to fight, and those are very different things. Winning looks like taking the station intact. Fighting looks like a protracted siege against a station that's still somehow talking to authority command through a gas cloud." He paused. "I think First Commander Velthari is a professional who prefers winning to fighting." The clock hit 0 4 minutes later. Nothing happened. I mean that literally. The clock hit 0, we all knew it. The operations center went completely silent for about 15 seconds. And then nothing happened. No bombardment, no communications blackout. The Vrethkai fleet did not move. The sensor readings showed them holding position, the way an army holds position when it's waiting for something. Vassal let out a very quiet breath. He didn't say anything. He just looked at his display and then looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked back at his display. In the cafeteria, which was still on continuous service, people who'd been checking their chronometers every few minutes apparently realized the deadline had passed quietly and responded in a way that I heard about from 3 different people afterward. They went back to eating. One woman apparently raised her coffee cup in a small, private toast to nobody in particular, then drank it and asked for a refill. The bar, the margin, had been open continuously for the last 30 hours at this point. Yusuf later told me that he'd been prepared for one of 2 things to happen at deadline 0, either nothing or everything. He'd made peace with both. He'd stocked extra glasses either way. The response from First Commander Velthari came 31 minutes after the deadline. It was longer than I expected. It was also, in translation, somewhat different in tone than anything that had come before. There was a word in it that the translators flagged for contextual uncertainty, a Vrethkai term that had no perfect human equivalent, but that the translation team rendered as something between unexpected and regarded with new interest. The closest approximation was that Velthari found us surprising. He wanted to talk. The negotiation took 11 days. This is not a story about the negotiation. The negotiation involved people with far more seniority than me, and it took place at a level of institutional complexity that I was not privy to and wouldn't have understood fully even if I had been. What I know is what everyone on the station knew. The fleet held position. The 48-hour deadline became a memory. Days passed. Conversations happened. Both sides apparently said difficult things to each other, and both sides apparently listened, which is not as common as it should be. On the 5th day of the negotiation, something small happened that I think about more than the fleet. I was in the cafeteria, actually eating, actually sleeping by this point, the immediate crisis having transitioned into something more extended and less acute, and there was a screen on the wall running the publicly available feed of the cloud data, which we decided to share station-wide because people found it calming to watch. The cloud's patterns shifted slowly, beautifully, in long ribbons of color. Sometimes you could see the faint evidence of a large mass moving through the cloud's outer layer, a Vrethkai ship, probably maintaining patrol. The cloud recorded their presence the way water records the passage of a stone. Bex from the Geological Survey was there again. She had a proper meal this time, not just a quick something. She was eating slowly, watching the screen. "Funny thing," she said, when she noticed me sit down nearby. "What's that?" "We've been studying this cloud for 2 years," she said. "Cataloged the particle distribution, mapped the electromagnetic variance, published 3 papers on the ionization patterns. Very interesting, very scientifically significant, very," she gestured vaguely, "academic." She ate a bite of something, looked at the screen. "Took 64,000 ships for us to figure out we could actually use it." I didn't say anything immediately. "How often does that happen, do you think?" she asked. "You have the thing, you know the thing, but you don't quite know what the thing is for until someone comes along and gives you a reason to find out." She finished her meal, she left. I sat there for a while, watching the cloud. Part 4, The Shape of the Thing. Day 8 of the negotiation. The station had settled into something that wasn't quite normal but was at least routine. Shifts happened. Meals happened. People slept appropriate amounts and woke up and did their work and talked to each other in the corridors and the bar and the cafeteria, and the Vrethkai fleet held position outside, and the cloud held its patterns, and the twin suns made their ribbons through the gas. I was writing my daily external monitoring report, which had become significantly more interesting than it used to be, when Vassal appeared in the doorway. "Come look at something," he said. He took me to the small observation deck on the station's upper level, a mostly unused space because the viewport was positioned to face the cloud rather than open space, and clouds are less cinematically impressive than stars. But right now, looking at the cloud, with the knowledge of what was moving through it, it felt like the most important view in the station. The Vrethkai ships weren't visible directly, but you could see the cloud's response to them, the way the ionized particles deflected slightly around large masses, creating subtle, shifting shadow shapes in the gas. If you knew what you were looking for, it was like seeing ghosts. There, Vassal said, pointing to a region on the left side of the cloud. That formation, see how it's shifted in the last 6 hours. I saw it. The shadow shapes had moved. They'd moved in a specific direction, pulling back from their forward positions and regrouping toward the fold points. Not retreating, more like repositioning. The way you'd reposition in a negotiation when you're considering a concession. They're pulling back the forward elements, I said. Quietly, without announcement, while the talks are happening, he paused. That's a concession. They're reducing the immediate threat posture without being explicit about it, so they don't have to formally acknowledge they've made a concession. To save face. To preserve their position. Same thing from the inside. I watched the shadow shapes for a moment. They're going to agree to something, I said. Looks like it. What change do you think, specifically? Vassal was quiet for a moment. He had that economical expression on his face, the one that meant he was actually thinking rather than preparing to say something. I think, he said slowly, that they came here expecting to deal with prey. And instead they found out they were dealing with something else. What's something else? Something that doesn't, he paused, searching, process the situation the way they expected. They modeled us based on what panic does to a species, and we didn't panic, so their model broke. And when your model breaks, you have to actually look at the thing in front of you instead of the model. He turned away from the viewport. And when they looked at the thing in front of them, he said, what they saw was 4,000 people who understood exactly how dangerous the situation was and kept working anyway. That's, he made a small gesture, that's not nothing. That changes the calculation. The agreement was announced on the 11th day. I won't go into all of it. The details are public record, but the important parts were, the station remained. The Vrethkai claim to the Merlith system was formally addressed through a joint research designation that gave both species access to the cloud data and established collaborative protocols for the relay network. First Commander Velthari sent a formal communication to Commander Rills that was translated and posted for the whole station to read. In it, he used that word again, the one that meant something between unexpected and regarded with new interest. He said, the humans of Station Merlith have demonstrated a quality of response that we did not anticipate and that our prior engagement with your species had not prepared us for. We came here with a specific understanding of what would happen. That understanding was incorrect. We regard this incorrectness not as a defeat but as information. He said, we will require time to revise our models. Rills sent back a response that was 5 sentences long, warm, direct, professional. It contained no boasting, no triumph, no chest beating, just acknowledgement and a path forward. When I read it, I thought, that's the whole thing right there. That's the whole story. They came expecting something. We were something else. They needed time to update. The response fleet arrived on day 12, which was technically 1 day after it needed to. 12 ships. Nothing enormous. These weren't dreadnoughts. They were rapid response frigates, fast and capable but not overwhelming. They came through the fold point at the edge of the system and took up positions that were, in Vassal's professional assessment, polite. Not aggressive, not retreating, just present. Commander Rills went out to meet the fleet's commanding officer in the docking bay when the shuttle came in. I wasn't in the docking bay, but I heard about it afterward from 2 different people who were. The fleet commander was a woman named Admiral Seo Young-hee. She was by all accounts an impressive figure, the kind of military presence that fills a room when it enters, even in a docking bay at the end of a 12-day crisis. She came off the shuttle with her staff and stopped in front of Commander Rills and looked at him for a moment. "I read your reports," she said. "Yes, Admiral. All of them in real time mostly." She paused. "You used the gas cloud to communicate." "We did. Nobody's done that before." "No, ma'am." "And you told the first commander you'd figured out they weren't going to bombard." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him. Bold move. Rills apparently shrugged slightly. It was accurate. Another pause. "Walk me through it," she said, "from the beginning." And they walked, apparently, for 2 hours, through the station that had held for 11 days with nothing but its own people and a gas cloud, and the particular quality of mind that comes from not panicking when panic would be useless. Part 5. What I carry. I left Merlith 14 months after the incident. Rotating transfer, standard procedure. I'd been promoted twice in those 14 months, which I'm including not to brag, but because it's relevant to what I'm about to say. The second promotion interview involved an officer asking me what I thought was the most important thing I'd learned at Merlith. She asked it in the specific way that interview questions get asked, clinical, careful, waiting for the prepared answer. I'd had time to think about it. I gave her the prepared answer, which was true but not the deepest truth. I said something about resource utilization and adaptive response, and the value of cross-departmental collaboration. She nodded. She wrote something down. Then she asked what I thought of it personally. I was quiet for a moment. What I think personally is that the most important thing about Merlith wasn't anything tactical. It wasn't the cloud sensor system, brilliant as that was. It wasn't Vassal's fleet analysis or Castellan's electromagnetic modeling or Pyrrha's communication relay or Marcus's engineering solutions. Those were all extraordinary things produced by extraordinary people. The most important thing was the 4 seconds of silence after the war declaration before someone said, "Yeah, okay," and went back to their lunch. Because that silence wasn't ignorance. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't denial. It was recognition. It was people looking at the situation, understanding exactly what it was, and reaching the collective, unspoken conclusion that the appropriate response was not fear but work. The Vrethkai had a model of us. The model said that a species that panics can be coerced through the threat of destruction. And they weren't wrong about the principle. That's how coercion works. The problem was they were applying it to a species that had apparently, somewhere in its long and complicated history of being small and vulnerable and surrounded by things that could kill it, developed a different response to threat. Not fearlessness, not recklessness. Just this: recognize the thing clearly, then ask what can be done about it. That's it, that's the whole thing. That's what 4,000 people on a frontier station did for 11 days against 65,000 warships. They looked at it clearly. They asked what could be done, and then they did it. I've talked to Vassal a few times since. He's stationed somewhere in the outer belt now, doing whatever it is he does, probably eating eggs and mapping fleet dispositions. He sent me a message when my second promotion came through, which I thought was nice. He said, "Heard about the promotion. Well deserved. By the way, I finished the Merlith analysis. Remember what I said about the gap in their formation? I was right about the approach vector but wrong about the timing by about 6 minutes. If they'd moved, we'd have had 36 minutes of warning, not 42. I updated the model." That was the whole message. I read it 3 times and smiled. Preet retired from active service about 8 months after the incident. She sent me a note. She said she was going back to Earth, to a small university where she'd been offered a position teaching strategic analysis. She said she was looking forward to it. She also said I kept the notebook, all of it. I know which page I'd want to see. The one from the 43rd day. Her 3 expected items and then below them in her neat, unhurried handwriting. 64,000 ships. Also, learn the cloud. Castellan published 5 papers based on the Merlith cloud research. 2 of them are considered foundational to the field. The Cloud Communication Protocol is now in the Standard Tactical Manual under the designation MRC-1, Merlith Relay Communication, Type 1. Piera, the graduate student, finished her dissertation and is now a research lead on 2 joint projects with Vrethkai scientists. Joint projects with the same species that came to Merlith with 65,000 warships. It took them 14 months to revise their models. Apparently, we're not what they expected. Dr. Castellan, in one of his papers, wrote a section about the cloud's properties that ended with a line I've quoted to people several times since. He wrote, "The Merlith cloud was categorized as a sensor-dead zone for its entire period of known observation. This categorization was accurate based on the assumptions applied to it. When the assumptions were revised, when necessity produced a different question, the cloud revealed itself to be the most sophisticated communication medium in the outer systems. What had been invisible was always there. We simply hadn't yet understood what we were looking at." He was talking about the cloud. He was also, I think, talking about us. Epilogue, something PRET said. A year and a half after Merlith, I ran into Preet at a conference. She was there to give a lecture. I was there to attend a briefing. We found each other in the cafeteria, which was better than Merlith's cafeteria in every measurable way but still had that slight institutional flavor, the smell of food produced at scale. We talked for an hour. Mostly about other things, the state of the frontier, mutual acquaintances, the food. But at the end, just before we had to go our separate ways, she said something I've been turning over ever since. She said, "You know what the Vrethkai never accounted for?" I said I didn't. She said, "Boredom." I waited. "They studied us," she said. "Their intelligence files were thorough. They had our weapons, our infrastructure, our logistics. They knew our response times and our shield tolerances and our communication protocols." She picked up her coffee cup, looked at it. What they didn't have was any record of 4,000 people on a frontier station being mind-numbingly bored for 2 years before this happened. She smiled slightly. We'd been watching a gas cloud do nothing for 2 years. 2 years of the same data, the same variance reports, the same cloud. Bex had published 3 papers on it and was starting to wonder if there was anything left to study. Castellan knew that cloud's electromagnetic signature, the way you know the sound of your own breathing. She set the cup down. So when the Vrethkai showed up with 65,000 ships, they thought they were showing us something we'd never seen before, something terrifying and incomprehensible, and maybe to another species in another situation it would have been. She paused. But for us, we'd been staring at that cloud for 2 years. We knew every quirk and pulse of it. When we needed to use it for something, when we finally had a reason to, it wasn't mystery anymore. It was a tool we already understood. We just hadn't known yet what we were going to use it for. She stood up to go. "That's the thing about boredom," she said. "If you let it be boredom, it's useless. But if you let it be attention," she made a small gesture, "the kind that means you know the rest, you end up knowing things you didn't realize you knew. And then one day you need to know them." She left. I sat there for a while. Then I finished my coffee. I had a briefing to get to.